But it turns out that journalist that was killed, that wasn't just a journalist. That journalist had picked sides. Not only picked sides, but was literally working on behalf of the terrorists. 3 of those hostages were actually being held in that journalist's home. A daring rescue. The Israeli Defense Forces went into an area of the Gaza territories and rescued 4 Israeli citizens who have been held since October 7th as hostages. We've got some footage actually that the IDF put out. It's some of that infrared footage from the helicopter or a drone, perhaps, watching the whole thing transpire. We've also seen some video now released of some of the hostage being escorted to some helicopters and then flown to safety. It's been a remarkable thing to see. One of the most daring, well-coordinated, only 1 casualty for the IDF, which is an absolute miracle. I mean, obviously, we pray for the family of that soldier, and we thank him for his sacrifice and his service. But what an incredible success. Of course, you wouldn't know it by seeing how the mainstream media has reacted to this. I want to share some of their disconcerting takes with you in just a moment because they have no moral compass. I would say they have a broken moral compass, but no, they actually have no moral compass at all. But first, I want to focus on an aspect of this story that has been covered by our friends over at Red State, which is, of course, affiliated with Town Hall Media. Here's Jennifer Van Laar running with this story this morning, or excuse me, yesterday afternoon. As you can see, confirmed journalist, in quotation marks, killed by IDF, held 3 Israeli hostages in his home. And he wrote for a U.S.-based nonprofit. Now, let's be clear here. Some of the initial reports of mainstream media, your New York Times, your Washington Post, your CNN, had this blaring headline that said, IDF forces killed journalist during raid to free hostages. They killed a journalist. So you have this image of somebody, reporting from the sidelines, with their notepad and their little hat with the pieces of paper sticking out of the hat band, right? And they've got a giant flak jacket on and vest that says press, and an IDF soldier just, indiscriminately shooting at him, saying, oh, you're press? Well, I'm going to kill you anyway. Get out of here, right? That was what it was meant to evoke, that these journalists who were war reporters were just there on the front lines trying to cover this in an impartial way. But it turns out that journalist that was killed, that wasn't just a journalist. That journalist had picked sides. Not only picked sides, but was literally working on behalf of the terrorists. 3 of those hostages were actually being held in that journalist's home. I think at that point you stop being a journalist. I think you're literally a terrorist at that point. As Jennifer Van Laar writes, in the wake of the Israeli Defense Forces' successful operation to rescue 4 hostages from captivity in Gaza, we're learning more about the conditions in which the hostages lived and who housed them. Once again, we're seeing that the native journalists covering the conflict are anything but neutral observers. So we noted in numerous stories about Israel's rescue mission, and yes, there's full comprehensive coverage at Red State and at Town Hall, as well as PJ Media. Take your pick. Town Hall Media has tons of different sites for you, whichever one fits your style and your personality. The 4 hostages rescued were not held in tunnels or prisons. They were held in the homes of alleged civilians in residential areas in Nuseirat. I say alleged civilians because if these people were holding Israeli hostages for 8 months, they're absolutely part of Hamas and are combatants, not civilians. One of those alleged civilians is now confirmed was Abdullah al-Jamal, who bills himself as a journalist and who wrote recently for a United States-based 501c3 non-government organization called the Palestine Chronicle. He also wrote at least one piece for Al Jazeera. The Israeli government confirmed Sunday that al-Jamal, who was neutralized by IDF rescuers, held 3 hostages captive in his family home. And she's got a quote there from the Israeli government saying, following an IDF and ISA investigation, we can now confirm that Abdullah al-Jamal held the hostages Al-Magmir Jan, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomi Ziv captive in his family home in Nuseirat. All right, so what does all that mean? Well, first of all, what it means is oftentimes when somebody is called a journalist, they're actually an activist that just happens to write and get published at news agencies. In this case, Al Jazeera, which is an Arab-based propaganda outfit out of the Middle East, and this thing called the Palestine Chronicle. So, honestly, I saw this and I thought, you remember that whole thing with Jamal Khashoggi, who we kept hearing was a journalist for the Washington Post, and he was murdered by the Saudi government. And yeah, it sure looks like the Saudi government killed him, and it was pretty despicable what they did to him. But was he really just a journalist? Was he really just a Washington Post columnist? I don't know. Maybe there's more to that story. I'm not saying he deserved to be killed and dismembered the way he was. I'm just saying, every time somebody is referred to as a journalist, especially in that part of the world, I think maybe there's more to it. You know how you have a business card and you have multiple titles? I think maybe you were doing more than just being a journalist, right? Just saying. But secondly, and more importantly for us here in America, you and I, we subsidized this guy's work. So this guy was holding Israeli hostages. He is a terrorist. He is in league with the terrorists. He is a combatant. He deserved to die if he was part and parcel to the illegal captivity of these innocent people. But you and I are paying for it because the Palestine Chronicle, which published his work and one assumes was part of his livelihood and subsidizing his existence, it enjoys tax-free status here in America. It's a 501c3. Our American tax code provides nonprofit status to charitable organizations who are doing nonprofit, non-governmental work, right? That can be a church. It can be a nonprofit theater or museum or art group. It can also be a charitable organization. I assume these people, the Palestine Chronicle, bill themselves as a not-for-profit clearinghouse for news out of this area that focuses on Palestinian issues. That's fine. Go ahead and claim that. But when one of the people working for you is actually one of the terrorists, well, then your tax-free status should be investigated. And because the Palestine Chronicle, which is based out of the Washington state, enjoys that government-approved and regulated 501c3 status, well, this means that the House of Representatives, specifically the Ways and Means Committee, run by Chairman Jason Smith, who has been part of uncovering all of the crimes of Hunter Biden, he could have a hearing about the Palestine Chronicle. He can subpoena the Palestine Chronicle. There should be a Justice Department investigation into the Palestine Chronicle, because when they get tax breaks, that means they don't pay taxes on their income. And that means to make up for the taxes they don't pay on for their income, you and I have to pay our taxes, higher taxes. If everybody who made income in America paid taxes on their income, then everybody's taxes would be lower. But there's a lot of people who make income, like the Palestine Chronicle, who get that income tax-free. And to make up for that, you and I have to pay it. That, in my opinion, is a subsidy. They enjoy tax-free status on the goodwill and good nature of the American people through our representatives in Congress. And maybe it's time for the Palestine Chronicle to have that status investigated and see what other criminal activities the people who work for the Palestine Chronicle is engaged in. In fact, maybe we should see what kind of criminal activities the Palestine Chronicle knowingly or even unknowingly pays for over in that area, considering this guy is one of their employees. And then there's the cover-up. Banshi, one of our most popular writers over at Red State, says Palestinian Chronicle, U.S. press go into overdrive after journalists caught holding hostages. On Saturday morning, Israeli forces stormed 2 buildings. The mission was to rescue 4 hostages being held in a refugee camp after they had been taken from the Nova Music Festival October 7th. A journalist named Abdullah al-Jamal was killed, as you know. But the truth is far more sinister. As Red State's Jennifer Van Larfers reported, the 3 male hostages were successfully rescued, were being held captive. And then he quotes the article we just read to you. But there's more. The Hamas-controlled Gaza Ministry of Health does not distinguish between Hamas and civilians specifically for the propaganda boost. Unfortunately, it works every single time because the mainstream press always diligently parrots whatever the Gaza Ministry of Health tells them, because it helps push a narrative they already want to propagate, which is that Palestinians are helpless victims completely detached from the consequences of their decisions. Regardless, once news broke that al-Jamal had been holding hostages, the cover-up attempt went into overdrive. CNN quickly brought out their without providing evidence line, which was often used during the Trump administration to try to insinuate that Israelis were lying. Here, look at these 2 headlines that Banshi points out. from CNN. Here's CNN. Yesterday marked Gaza's deadliest day in 6 months, Palestinian Health Ministry says. Now, again, we've said this before. The Palestinian Health Ministry is a propaganda arm. The health ministry gives out all of these numbers and gives out all of this data, and any responsible journalistic endeavor should qualify those numbers by saying, we can't validate this, we can't prove these things. For all we know, in fact, I think the UN has now confirmed that most of the numbers coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry is complete and total bull. But CNN, well, they just go ahead and take their numbers and write an article about it. However, when the IDF announced that the person who was holding the hostages was a journalist, CNN was quick to caveat that. Israel alleges journalists held hostages in Gaza without providing evidence. Isn't that beautiful? Although, I'll be honest with you, I prefer that CNN did than this utter piece of garbage from the Washington Post. This is their headline on the effort to successfully rescue the 4 hostages. More than 200 Palestinians killed in Israeli hostage raid in Gaza. See, the headline is how many Palestinians were killed, not the fact that 4 hostages were rescued and liberated. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's like they don't even try to hide it anymore. By the way, that 200 Palestinians number, it's also from the Gaza Ministry of Health. We don't know if it's real or not. But, I don't know. Hard for me to have my heart broken over the so-called innocent civilians who were killed in this effort when Hamas, the government they voted for, elected, and still support, purposely hide these hostages in civilian homes to theoretically keep them from being rescued because they think they know that Israelis actually have a higher moral code. They purposely put their civilians out there to be killed because it works propaganda-wise for them. And meanwhile, Israel, they're trying to rescue and mitigate losses as much as possible. But that's the difference between a terrorist and an actual legitimate state. NBC News today had a reporter say that the biggest problem with this rescue mission that IDF just successfully concluded is that it's going to make it harder for Joe Biden to get a political win.
Senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez. Gabe, tell us what we know about the U.S.'s involvement in this particular rescue, and tell us why the White House believes it might be feasible to negotiate directly with Hamas.
Hey there, Hoda. Good morning. The Biden administration confirmed the U.S. did not participate militarily in the rescue operation, but the U.S. provided intelligence in support of it, according to a U.S. official with knowledge of the matter. Still, there are concerns that Saturday's rescue may hurt efforts to reach a ceasefire and free the remaining hostages, including the 8 Americans.
There's concern that the rescue effort, is going to harm chances for a prolonged ceasefire. That's their concern. We just rescued hostages. Well, the IDF just rescued hostages. And the concern is that Joe Biden isn't going to get his precious ceasefire. It would be one of the most enraging takes on this whole thing if it weren't for the BBC. Look at this spokesperson for the IDF speaking with a BBC reporter. Again, this is after a surprise attack that successfully rescued 4 hostages being held by the Palestinian terrorists. It's a surprise move, right? You have to sneak in to get them. Otherwise, the terrorists are going to kill the hostages, right? Now, listen to the question that the BBC journalist asks.
Been a warning to those civilians for them to get out on time.
For sure, of course, we cannot anticipate Israel to be warning ahead of a raid to extract or to save hostages, because then what the terrorists would do is to kill the hostages, and that would defeat the purpose. So, of course, we cannot expect that.
I mean, are they stupid or are they just evil? There's grave concerns here that before your surprise rescue of these hostages, that you didn't give everybody advanced warning. well, then it wouldn't have been a surprise. You see, the reason that we sneak in there and we don't tell anybody that we're coming is so that the terrorists don't kill the hostages, so that we can't rescue them, because, they're terrorists. That's what they would do. So if we alerted all of the people in the area that, hey, we're coming to rescue the hostages, that would kind of mess up the surprise. Do I really need to answer this? Are you a bot? Is this like an AI malfunctioning anime that I'm talking to? That's where we are these days. I'm glad we're on the side of the good guys.